Hey folks, Phil Gallagher of ThrabenU here for a quick video on the Monarch mechanic. I wanted to do this in article form, but if I'm being completely honest, I don't have time to articulate everything well, do all the card links, do all my editing and stuff. So instead I wanted to just get it out there and vomit it all out in sort of a 5-ish minute video. So people are talking a lot about the Monarch mechanic, and as a D&D player and player of a decent number of other jank decks, I've played with the Monarch mechanic a whole lot. And I just kind of wanted to give you some generic advice and tell you what some of my thoughts are on the Monarch mechanic in 2020 as of right now. Okay, number one, the Palace Jailer is the most commonly used Monarch card in Legacy as of right now. So I'm just going to talk about a lot of my monarchy thoughts through the lens of Palace Jailer and use that as an obvious point of comparison. Palace Jailer is frequently uncounterable, and that's for one of three reasons. Number one is that decks like Soldier Stompy and D&T often play Cavernous Souls. Or, number two, it's put in via Ether Vial. Or, number three, you have exhausted your opponent of counters by the time that Palace Jailer actually comes down. So if you're playing a deck like Soldier Stompy, a lot of times the first couple of counterspells your opponents have are answering things like Chalice of the Void and Thorn of Amethyst that otherwise would set them back way too much. So if you do something like turn 1 Chalice, turn 2 Thorn, turn 3 Jailer, your Jailer is pretty likely to resolve because either your opponent has used forces to stop your lock pieces from hitting, or something like a Thorn of Amethyst is keeping them from actually resolving those things. And then there's Cavernous Souls and Vial to factor in. So very frequently when you played a Palace Jailer, for one reason or another, it actually resolved and it started that Monarch subgame. I say this because I don't think the same is necessarily going to be true of the new Monarch cards, because most of them are on enchantments, right? And enchantments are going to be prone to things like Spell Pierce, that Palace Jailer is naturally going to be avoiding just due to its creature typing. And the blue court, or the enchantment that taps a creature, those will be prone to Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast, which are incredibly common sideboard cards and even main deckable in some decks, such as Painter. And I think that the blue control decks that are going to jam a couple of these Monarch cards into them are going to realize that they're not making the Palace Jailer uncounterable in quite the same way that a lot of the current Monarch decks or decks that are utilizing the Monarch mechanic are. So I think the control player is going to have to fight back over getting their Monarch card to resolve more frequently than a deck like D&T has to wiggle to get that Palace Jailer to resolve, because it tends to just resolve or get into play more naturally. All right, next up. I think that a lot of the Monarch cards in this new set are going to feel slower than Palace Jailer. Now let me explain what I mean. Jailer has two triggers when it enters the battlefield, one of which exiles a creature, and one of which gives you the crown. So the drawing a card from the Monarch mechanic happens not instantly, but very close to instantly. And the ETB trigger, if it's relevant, that exiles a creature, happens instantly. Whereas with this new cycle of Monarch cards, most of the value that you're getting off of them comes in the upkeep. It's your own upkeep when you get to mill something or make a 4/4 angel or whatever effect it is that you're looking for. So Palace Jailer generates both of its value effects upon entering the battlefield. It nukes an opposing creature, and it also starts the Monarch subgame. Whereas these new enchantments only start the Monarch subgame immediately, and then they need to stick around for another turn before they really start getting their value. And because it doesn't remove a creature, and because it requires more time to really start generating that value, I think these cards, despite being very powerful, are going to feel a little bit less immediately impactful than a Palace Jailer might have. And let's kind of talk about Palace Jailer and the history of the Monarch mechanic, just super briefly. Oversimplifying, Palace Jailer was at its peak when Blue White Miracles was one of the better control decks, and the deck has almost no creatures. Like, it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that the deck only had, maybe 2 or 3 Snapcaster Mages and maybe an Entreat the Angels in game 1. So if you stick a Palace Jailer, the chance of your opponent being able to take the crown from you was exceptionally low. In post-sideboard games, this was sometimes a little bit different because things like Containment Priest or Vendilion Clique sometimes came in and changed that map a little bit. Now let's go past that period. Let's talk about like post-top Miracles, but pre-2019 control decks. So this would be things like the Deathrite Shaman, Grixis control, 4-color control decks, the things in that sort of era. Palace Jailer was considered risky in some of these matchups because while if it stuck and you kept the crown, you almost always won the game. If you played Palace Jailer and then your opponent went like bolt one of your idiots, snap bolt, attack in, or something equivalent to that, you almost never came back from that. The community consensus on the D&T side was that those matchups were a little bit rough, and so it was correct to just like jam the Monarch mechanic when you could and try to ride that to victory. So in the post-Miracles world, where those decks are playing a few more creatures, but the creatures aren't super problematic, the Monarch mechanic was already a little bit of a hot button topic. But now let's think about 2019, 2020 control decks that get Icefang Coatl and Oko. And this means that Palace Jailer sees almost no play in D&T now, despite the fact that it can, in theory, be very good against control decks and historically has presented itself as something that's very good against control decks. Now it doesn't really feel good in those matchups anymore, at least in my opinion. It feels great in the mirror steel, but otherwise it's questionable. So the Monarch mechanic isn't free anymore against these control decks like it used to be, because Oko represents haste damage that you don't necessarily see coming. And the same is true of Icefang Coatl. Your opponent holds up 4 or 5 mana, you don't think too much of it, you know there could be a creature, but like maybe you're in a position where you need to like try to become the Monarch to pull ahead, so you do it, they Icefang, they attack in the air, and crap, you lost yourself the game. So a lot of people, I think, are going to start building decks around this Monarch mechanic, thinking that it's like the way that it was in, say, I don't know, what was that, 2017, 2018, and not realizing how many ways the blue decks have of taking back the crown anymore. These days, the Monarch play patterns are often forcing you to play in an overly conservative way that causes you to miss a lot of damage because you do need to be very fearful of an Oko coming in and creating an Elk out of an Astrolabe and crashing in for 3. You do need to be worrying about those Icefang Coatls coming in. So, like, consider a situation where you have 3 2/1 creatures or something like that. How many of them can you safely attack in with? You just attack in with 3, and if your opponent can take the Monarch, they can take the Monarch, and you'll try to deal with it later. You attack in with 1, only dealing 2 damage of a possible 6 in order to leave back 2 chump blockers. Like, where do you fall on that spectrum of risk reward? The Monarchy subgame is a subgame, and you often have to take overly conservative lines and miss out on real amounts of damage if you want to be protecting the Monarch. And this is probably obvious if you played with a Monarch mechanic before, but the subgame stays with you for the rest of that game. It doesn't disappear when your Monarch card disappears. You start that subgame, and it's there for the rest of the game. So you might play a Monarch card in a position where you can defend it for 1 or 2 turns, and that might be fine, but later on in the game, you still need to be able to take that Monarch back. So you might be able to, like, let's say you're using the white court. You might be able to go and like hold the Monarch for a couple of turns, that card is going to generate more bodies to allow you to take it back later. But what if you're playing the blue court and that one's just milling? You have to have a plan to be able to take back the crown later. So I don't know that you can just build a hard control deck that is just like Supreme Verdicts and counterspells and such without also having a few things to take the crown back in a fair fight. Okay, next up. One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the Monarch cards are going to be dead cards that you can't really play when you're behind. And this makes them very different from a lot of other 4-mana haymakers in the format. To use another white example, how about something like Gideon? Gideon on an empty board will immediately create a token and then attack for 7 total damage next turn, 5 from the Gideon, 2 from the token. And that represents a pretty big swing quickly. And if you're a little bit behind on board, your opponent might not be able to break the Gideon. Maybe it brings you back into the game. If you're significantly behind on the board, maybe your opponent is able to attack through and kill the Gideon, but you bought yourself a good amount of time. Well, what happens when you play something like the blue court when you're behind? Your opponent attacks you, they become the Monarch, they have all the creatures that are on board, they continue to draw all the cards, right? So your Monarch mechanic is very risky when you're behind. Palace Jailer was at least okay at catching you up and provided a disposable blocker, but many of these other Monarch cards are not necessarily going to do that, at least not immediately. So your 4-mana card or your 3-mana card might not be doing anything to impact the board, and it might be bad when you're behind. And control decks often are behind at the beginning of the game, and they stabilize as things go along. So there's deck building things to be thinking about there. Okay, next up. Losing the Monarch subgame almost always means losing the game. Now, can you beat a Monarch that was around for 8 turns? Yes, that is certainly theoretically possible. But it's kind of like fighting against the Oko that has been on board for 5 turns. It's a really uphill battle. Anecdotally, I find that the tipping point tends to be 2 or 3 turns, depending on the matchup, where if you stick around for that long, you have probably acquired enough resources to let you to continue to keep the monarchy and continue to pull ahead or stay ahead. Now, like, you can get out of that. Combo decks in particular can get out of that, but in a fair fight, 2 or 3 turns of getting an extra card every turn tends to bury the opponent. Notably, the more copies of Monarch enablers you have, the easier it is for you to retake the throne from these bad positions. So, Palace Jailer started out as a one-of in D&T, and when D&T and control decks were simultaneously popular, it was very common to have a second, or occasionally even a third Palace Jailer, so that you could fight the Monarch subgame better than your opponent could. So it was often a set of trumps where person 1 plays Palace Jailer, person 2 plays their own Palace Jailer and takes it. If person 1 has that second Palace Jailer, they have a leg up in being able to retake that Monarch and sort of spin the game. So something you want to be thinking about in doing deck building is how many of these Monarch effects do you actually want to have? Is it just a one of to treat as a win condition? Is it a two of so that if things go wrong, you can take it back? Is it more than that? Is it going to be a central part of your strategy? I think it is going to be hard to build decks entirely around the Monarch mechanic, where the Monarch cards are your win condition, because against combo in particular, it's really dangerous to tap out for these 3 and 4 mana haymakers that don't immediately do something to stop the combo deck. So a deck like maybe Ant or TES or maybe even Depths, if you tap out for those big enchantments, there's a very good chance that you die, that your opponent combos you off or does something that puts them in such an advantageous position that you don't come back for it. So I don't know that these can be the sole win conditions for a blue deck. It's often going to be much safer to hold up a bunch of mana for counter magic and peck someone to death with a Snapcaster Mage or a Vandalion Click or whatever sort of win condition of that nature you have. A Meddling Mage is a great example of that as well. Um, so I think a lot of the Monarch cards are going to end up being very, very potent sideboard cards in many of these blue decks, but I don't know that you can rely wholly on them. And for people who are wanting to play with these Monarch cards, I think a very important distinction you should be making when you're doing your deck building is, am I playing a Monarch deck or am I playing a deck that has a card with the word Monarch on it? I think those things are very different. Let's consider the difference between Soldier Stompy and D&T. D&T is a deck that has a card with Monarch in it. You can win games very easily without it. It is a side portion of the strategy. Whereas for Soldier Stompy, Palace Jailer is usually one of the cards that the deck is primarily built around. It is a 4 of, it is meant to be done uncounterably via Cavern of Souls. It can be put in or found with other soldier/human related effects that are in the deck. One of those decks is trying to push the Monarch mechanic to its maximum and use that to recoup card disadvantage from early things like Chrome Mox and Lotus Petal. The other is just using it as a tool that's in the toolbox. If you are looking to build a Monarch deck, maybe be considering cards like Moat. They're going to allow you to really break the sort of symmetrical nature of the Monarch cards and really let you be the one who is keeping the Monarch the whole time. And that'll buy a whole bunch of time for you to do your things. You can consider non-traditional angles in deck building with the Monarch. So for example, if you are able to blink these enchantments somehow with, like, say, a Flicker Wisp, you can get the Monarch back in that way. If you are playing the blue court, you can self-mill yourself and do something cool with that. Self-mill yourself, use that to find fuel for your Uro. Self-mill yourself, oh, all of a sudden I have cast Replenish and I have returned 6 other Monarch enchantments from my graveyard to the battlefield. That was an idea that Lawrence Harmon came up with that I think is super cute. I don't know that it works out in practice, but that's a hell of an idea. And finally, the last thing that I want to say about the Monarch mechanic is when you are doing your deck building, ask yourself whether what you're doing is better than just trying to win the game. I think Monastery Mentor is probably a good bar to set there. Is what you're doing going to be better than a Monastery Mentor? That card is restricted in Vintage, and that card is very, very dumb in Legacy, where you just cast cantrip into cantrip into cantrip 1 or 2 turns in a row, and it usually ends up killing your opponent. Against the combo decks in particular, Mentor presents a very real, very scary clock that is going to close the game much faster than a lot of these Monarch-based enchantments are. So when asking yourself, why am I playing this? Make sure that what you're doing is going to feel better than Oko or Mentor or the green-red god whose name I am totally Clothis. Whether it's better than Clothis in helping you to stabilize the board, kill your opponent, also give you additional mana. There's a lot of things that are very, very powerful that have been printed in the last 2 years. Really ask yourself whether the Monarch cards you're playing are going to be better than those. Okay, so much for a 5-minute video. That was apparently 19 minutes of me talking. So I'm really glad that I didn't do this in article form. It would have taken me forever to do all of that editing. Anyway, I hope this was useful to you all in thinking about the Monarch mechanic. Have a great rest of the day, folks.